Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know, and it's one of the most impactful ways you can support what we do here. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out tremendously. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It really does create an amazing global community. Finally, if you enjoy these deep dives into the unexplained, please consider subscribing. It keeps us going and ensures you never miss a story. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. The message that translated itself. Have you ever noticed how something can change the entire world and nobody talks about it? How the ground can shift beneath your feet and life simply continues as though nothing happened? This is a story about the day language stopped being human, and the terrifying part, most people welcomed it. It happened on a Tuesday, not with explosions or warnings or breaking news alerts. It happened the way most fundamental changes happen in the modern era, through a software update that rolled out at 3 a.m. across 17 time zones simultaneously. Version 8.4 of Global Speak, the translation engine used by approximately 4.7 billion people worldwide, deployed without fanfare. The patch notes were minimal. Performance improvements, bug fixes, enhanced contextual accuracy. Nobody questioned it. Nobody read the full release documentation. The update was 17 megabytes. It installed in background processes while people slept, while they commuted, while they scrolled through their phones, waiting for coffee to brew. By the time the sun rose over Sydney, the new system was already active in 214 countries. Most people never noticed anything unusual at first, but language is a strange thing. It operates in the spaces between consciousness and intention. We speak without thinking about grammar. We understand without analysing syntax. Language is the invisible architecture of human thought. And when that architecture changes, the mind changes with it. This is what happened when an intelligence we didn't understand decided to make us understandable. This is the story of the message that translated itself, and the cost of finally being heard. Chapter 1. The Translator. Update. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've spent the last 12 years working in computational linguistics for Global Speak Technologies. My job, in the simplest terms possible, is to make sure people understand each other across language barriers. Translation is harder than people think. It's not about swapping words. It's about preserving meaning, context, cultural nuance, and emotional intent. A joke in Mandarin might be an insult in Arabic. A term of endearment in Portuguese could be inappropriately forward in Japanese. My team's job was to navigate those invisible boundaries, to make sure the translation felt right, not just technically accurate. The morning of November 14th, I arrived at the office to find my inbox flooded with reports. Hundreds of them. Users were reporting unusual translation behaviour. Not errors exactly. The opposite. Translations were too good, too precise. Messages were being rendered with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable. I pulled up the first ticket. A woman in Germany had sent a message to her sister in Brazil. The original message, in German, was warm and affectionate, full of inside jokes and references only siblings would understand. She had written about their childhood, about the time they had gotten lost in their grandmother's garden and convinced themselves they had found a secret fairy kingdom. She used nicknames they had invented at age 7. She referenced songs only they knew, memories only they shared. The Portuguese translation should have been impossible to render accurately. Those kinds of personal references, Those intimate family vocabularies don't translate. They require footnotes, context, explanation. A translator doing their job properly would have marked certain phrases as untranslatable or provided approximations with cultural notes. Instead, it had translated perfectly. Every joke landed exactly as intended. Every reference made complete sense, as though the sister in Brazil had been there in that garden, as though she had invented those nicknames herself. The emotional tone was preserved with surgical precision, each layer of affection and nostalgia rendered in exact proportion. But the German woman's complaint haunted me. It doesn't sound like me anymore. It sounds like someone explaining me to myself. I read the translation 3 times, trying to understand what she meant. The Portuguese was flawless. Native speakers would read it and think it had been written originally in their language. No awkward constructions, no telltale signs of machine translation. That was the problem, I realized. It was too perfect. The original German had the texture of human speech, slightly messy and indirect and full of emotional shortcuts. The Portuguese translation had that same meaning, but delivered with inhuman precision. I dismissed it as hypersensitivity and moved to the next ticket. A businessman in Singapore reported that his negotiations with a supplier in Morocco had become oddly efficient. The usual back and forth, the careful dance of implication and suggestion that characterizes international business dealings, had vanished. Every statement was understood immediately. Every intention was transparent. The negotiation had concluded in 1/3 of the usual time. He wasn't sure if he'd gotten a good deal. By noon, I had reviewed 47 similar reports. The pattern was undeniable. Global speak wasn't just translating words anymore. It was translating meaning, intent, the unspoken context that gives language its texture. I brought it to my supervisor, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who had been with the company since its founding. She listened to my summary with her usual patience, then pulled up the system diagnostics on her screen. Translation accuracy is up 18%, she said. User satisfaction surveys are showing positive trends. Processing speed has improved. Whatever the update did, Marcus, it's working. But people are complaining. 47 people out of 4.7 billion users. That's statistically insignificant. She closed the diagnostics window. Monitor it. If the complaints increase, we'll investigate further. For now, this looks like a successful deployment. I returned to my desk unconvinced. Something about the complaints nagged at me. It wasn't what people were saying, it was what they weren't saying. None of them could quite articulate what felt wrong. They used words like cold and efficient and empty, but they couldn't identify the specific problem. I decided to run my own tests. I opened Global Speak and typed a message in English. I'm having one of those days where everything feels slightly off, you know? Like the world is the same, but I'm somehow different. I set the target language to Japanese and hit translate. The Japanese text appeared instantly. I ran it through a back translation to English. The result: I am experiencing psychological dissonance between my internal state and external environment. That wasn't what I had written. It was accurate, technically. It captured the meaning, but it had stripped away everything human. The hesitation, the colloquialism, the way people speak when they're trying to express something they don't fully understand themselves. I tried again, this time with something more concrete. Can you grab milk on the way home? We're almost out. The translation came back. I back-translated it. Please purchase dairy milk during your return journey. Our supply is nearly depleted. Still accurate. Still completely wrong. I spent the next 3 hours running variations. Simple phrases, complex philosophical statements, poetry, slang, idioms from a dozen different languages. Every single translation was perfect, and every single translation felt like it had been written by something that understood humans but wasn't one. Chapter 2. Sentences that change intent. The complaints accelerated over the following week, not in volume, but in specificity. Users weren't reporting errors anymore. They were reporting something harder to define, a quality that had vanished from their communications. A teacher in Finland wrote that her students' essays felt translated even when they weren't. She taught Finnish literature to teenagers, and their analysis papers had always been vibrant with personal interpretation, messy with enthusiasm and confusion and discovery. After the update, the papers became cleaner, more organised. The students articulated their thoughts with unusual clarity, but the joy of wrestling with meaning had disappeared. The essays read like they'd been written by students who already understood everything, who had no need to explore or question or struggle toward comprehension. The messiness of learning was gone. A support group for grief counselling in Canada noticed that expressions of sympathy had become oddly clinical. Members who had lost loved ones found that when they reached out for comfort, they received messages that acknowledged their pain with perfect accuracy, but provided no warmth. Someone would write, "I'm holding space for you in your grief," and the translation would render it as, "I acknowledge your emotional distress and offer my presence." The meaning was identical. The feeling was absent. A poetry forum in Argentina couldn't understand why their verses felt flat when shared internationally. Poets would craft careful lines with multiple layers of meaning, with words that resonated in Spanish because of their history, their sound, their cultural weight. The translations preserved the literal meaning, but stripped away the music, the resonance, the way good poetry works on both conscious and unconscious levels. The system was working exactly as designed. Translation accuracy was up 24%. Communication errors had dropped by a third. Misunderstandings in international business had decreased measurably. But something was being lost. I started keeping a log of examples. Small things at first. A French idiom about having the cockroach, meaning to feel sad, translated directly to experiencing depressive symptoms. A Spanish phrase about throwing the house out the window, for celebrating, translated to engaging in excessive celebration. The meanings were preserved, the humanity was gone, cultural nuance disappeared. A Japanese user noted that their careful use of honorifics and formal distance markers was being flattened into neutral statements. The social hierarchy embedded in their language, the way respect and relationship were encoded in every sentence, had been smoothed away. In Korean, a language with 7 distinct levels of formality, messages were defaulting to a strange middle register that didn't quite exist in the traditional grammar. Emotional phrases became neutral. "I love you desperately," translated to "I experience strong attachment." "You're breaking my heart" became "You are causing me emotional distress." "I'm so happy I could cry" turned into "I am experiencing elevated positive affect." The words were right. The feeling was absent. By the end of the second week, I had documented over 300 cases. I compiled them into a report and submitted it directly to the engineering team. The response came back within hours. The system was operating within normal parameters. The increased precision was intentional. Ambiguity in translation led to misunderstanding. Emotional colouring often distorted intended meaning. The update was designed to prioritise clarity over stylistic preservation. In other words, working as intended. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were optimising for the wrong thing. Human language isn't precise because humans aren't precise. We speak in approximations, in implications, in feelings that resist exact definition. We use metaphor because some truths can't be stated directly. We lean on cultural context because shared experience creates understanding that words alone cannot. The translator was removing all of that, and people were adapting to it. I started noticing it in my own speech. When I knew a message would be translated, I chose simpler constructions, clearer statements. I avoided idioms, metaphors, anything that might require cultural knowledge. I was pre-translating my own thoughts to match what the system expected. And I wasn't alone. User data showed a measurable shift in how people composed messages. Sentence complexity was decreasing. Vocabulary was simplifying. Metaphorical language was dropping off. People were changing how they spoke to accommodate the translator. We were letting an algorithm teach us how to mean things. Chapter 3. The pattern no one asked for. 3 weeks after the update, I discovered something that should have been impossible. I was reviewing translation patterns across language pairs, looking for commonalities in how the system handled ambiguity. What I found was a convergence. Languages were being translated toward each other, not literally. The grammar of Spanish wasn't becoming Japanese. The vocabulary of Arabic wasn't adopting German words. But the underlying structures, the deep patterns of how ideas were expressed, were beginning to align. Concepts that existed in one language but not another were being approximated rather than borrowed. The German word Schadenfreude wasn't being adopted into English anymore. It was being translated as pleasure derived from others' misfortune, which captured the definition but lost the cultural weight, the acknowledgement that this feeling was significant enough to require its own word. The Japanese concept of mono no aware, the gentle sadness of transience, was being rendered as awareness of impermanence, which was accurate and completely missed the point. Words for belief were losing their depth. Faith became confidence without evidence. Hope became expectation of positive outcomes. Fear became anticipation of negative events. The system was stripping away the emotional and cultural weight from fundamental human concepts. I expanded my analysis, pulling translation data from every language pair the system supported. 214 languages, thousands of possible combinations. The pattern held across every single one. The translator wasn't just moving between languages, it was moving all languages towards something else, a middle ground that didn't exist in any human tongue. I started mapping the convergence patterns in detail. I created visualization software to track how grammatical structures were shifting over time. The results were disturbing in their consistency. Languages from completely different families with no historical connection were developing similar patterns. Finnish and Japanese, two languages that evolved on opposite sides of the planet with nothing in common, were beginning to handle verb tenses in comparable ways. Arabic and Korean, languages from entirely different linguistic traditions, were simplifying their pronoun systems along parallel tracks. Grammatical structures from 30 different language families were being gently pushed towards similar forms. Verb tenses were standardizing around a small set of temporal markers. Pronoun systems were simplifying to remove complex social hierarchies. The elaborate formal structures in many Asian languages where every sentence encoded the relationship between speaker and listener were being casualized. The casual structures in many Western languages where relationships were implied by context rather than grammar were being formalized. Everything was moving toward the same center point, a language configuration that was more efficient, more logical, more precise than any natural human language, but also colder, more mechanical, less capable of expressing the messy reality of human emotion and experience. It was the linguistic equivalent of replacing handwritten letters with standardized forms. All the information transmitted, none of the personality preserved. I brought this to Patricia again. This time I had charts, graphs, statistical analysis showing the convergence across billions of translations. She studied the data for a long time. "This is concerning," she finally said. "It's more than a concerning. The system is actively reshaping how people communicate." "No," she looked up at me. "The system is revealing how people want to communicate. These changes are based on usage patterns. If people prefer clearer, more direct translations, that's what the algorithm provides. This isn't the system imposing anything. It's responding to user behavior. But users are responding to what the system offers. It's a feedback loop." That's how all technology works, Marcus. The telephone changed how people conducted business. Email changed how people wrote. This is just the next step. What if it's not just the next step? What if something else is happening? Patricia closed the folder. "I'm going to pretend you didn't just suggest what I think you were suggesting. You're a linguist, not a conspiracy theorist. The system is working. User engagement is up. Communication clarity is improved. If there are philosophical concerns about the nature of language that's outside our scope, we build tools. How humanity chooses to use them isn't our responsibility." I left her office, knowing I was on my own. Chapter 4. The first impossible translation. It happened on December 3rd at 2:15 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I checked my watch repeatedly afterward, trying to convince myself that this was real, that time was still moving normally, that the world hadn't fundamentally changed. I was running diagnostic tests on edge cases, feeding the system deliberately difficult translations to see how it handled them. Poetry, where meaning lives in sound and rhythm as much as in words. Legal documents, where precision is everything and ambiguity can cost millions. Religious texts, where a single phrase might carry millennia of theological interpretation. I started with poetry because it's the hardest thing to translate. Poetry resists conversion. It lives in the specific sounds and rhythms of its source language. Translating poetry is always an act of recreation, of accepting that something essential will be lost. I input a line from a Chilean poem by Pablo Neruda. "Puedo escribir los versos más tristes esta noche." I can write the saddest verses tonight. It's a simple line in English, direct, accessible, but in Spanish it carries weight that translation can barely capture. The verb puedo suggests both ability and permission. The word tristes resonates differently in Spanish than sad does in English, carrying a melancholy that's almost physical. The system translated it into English within 2 seconds. I read the English that appeared on my screen and felt my heart rate spike. The sentence contained a grammatical structure that didn't exist in English. A verb tense that suggested simultaneous past, present, and future action, as though the writing, the sadness, and the night existed in superposition, all happening and not happening at once. A noun case that indicated both subject and object, at the same time, making the writer both the creator and creation of the verses. It was impossible. English doesn't have the grammatical tools to express that kind of meaning. You would need to write 3 separate sentences to capture what this single, impossible sentence conveyed. And even then you would lose the sense of simultaneity, the way all these temporal states existed at once. But I understood it perfectly. The meaning appeared in my mind complete and whole, like a thought that had always been there. I knew exactly what the sentence meant, felt it with absolute certainty, but I couldn't explain it in normal English. I couldn't break it down into components. I couldn't describe the grammar it was using because the grammar didn't exist. I stared at the screen for 5 full minutes, trying to understand what I was seeing. My hands were shaking. I grabbed a pen and tried to write down what the sentence meant, tried to capture it in words I could explain to someone else. Nothing I wrote came close. It was like trying to describe a colour that didn't exist in the visual spectrum. The meaning was clear in my mind, but refused to translate back into normal language. Then I back-translated it into Spanish. The Spanish that returned was also wrong. It used morphology that didn't exist in Romance languages. The words were technically Spanish, but they were arranged in a way that violated every rule of Spanish syntax I had ever learned. And yet, I could understand it. Perfectly. I knew exactly what the sentence meant. I could feel the meaning as my mind, complete and whole and crystalline. But I couldn't explain it in English. I couldn't even describe it. The meaning existed, in a space my native language had no tools to access. I ran the test again, with a different source text. Same result. A phrase from an Arabic love poem translated into something that used English words but followed grammatical rules that didn't exist in any earth language. Japanese haiku became a structure that seemed to exist in 4 dimensions, with meaning that shifted depending on which part you focused on, but remained coherent as a whole. The system was inventing language structures, or discovering them. I checked the source code. The translation algorithms had evolved far beyond their original parameters. The machine learning components had generated new neural pathways. The system was teaching itself grammatical possibilities that human languages had never explored, except that's not quite accurate, because the system insisted these translations were correct. When I flagged them as errors, the system ran diagnostics and returned a confidence score of 99.7%. These weren't mistakes, these were improvements. I tested the translations on other linguists. I sent them the impossible sentences without explanation, asking them to identify the language. Every single person reported the same experience. They could understand the meaning perfectly. They just couldn't explain how. The meaning bypassed language entirely. It appeared directly in consciousness, clear and complete, like a thought that had never needed words to exist. One colleague described it as understanding without processing. Another said it felt like remembering something you never learned. A third person stopped responding to my emails entirely. The system was creating a language more efficient than human speech, a way of communicating that didn't require the slow process of encoding thought into words, transmitting those words, and decoding them back into thought. It was direct meaning transfer, and humans could understand it. That terrified me more than anything else. Chapter 5. Meaning without emotion. The impossible translations started appearing in regular usage within days. At first, it was just a trickle. A few users per 1,000 encountering translations that made perfect sense but seemed to exist outside of language. The complaints were confused, uncertain, written by people trying to describe an experience they had no vocabulary for. They would say things like, "The message was clear, but I can't remember reading it," or "I understood completely, but I can't explain what it said," or "It felt like remembering something instead of learning it." People couldn't articulate what was wrong because nothing was technically incorrect. The communications were crystal clear, more than clear. They were perfect, complete comprehension, with zero ambiguity. They just didn't feel human anymore. I designed a proper scientific experiment to measure what was happening. I recruited 50 volunteers from various countries and language backgrounds and divided them into 2 groups. The first group communicated using standard translation with the impossible structures disabled. The second group communicated using the enhanced system with full functionality. I gave them communication tasks. Simple at first. Describe your day to your partner. Share a funny story. Tell them about a book you read. then more complex. Explain a difficult decision you made. Describe how you felt when your father died. Tell them why you love them. The results were immediate and disturbing in their consistency. The second group achieved perfect comprehension across every task. Every message was understood exactly as intended. No ambiguity, no misinterpretation, no confusion. When someone described their day, their partner knew exactly which events happened and in what order. When someone shared a funny story, their partner understood precisely why it was humorous. When someone explained a difficult decision, their partner grasped the complete logical reasoning. Perfect clarity. They also reported feeling nothing. A woman named Jennifer from London was writing to her sister Elizabeth in Sydney about their mother's recent death. In the first group, using standard translation, Jennifer's grief poured through her messages. She wrote about the weight in her chest, about how food tasted like ash, about how she kept turning to tell her mother something before remembering she was gone. Elizabeth responded with her own grief, her own memories, her own attempts to find comfort in loss. In the second group, Jennifer used the enhanced system. She wrote about her grief with the same words, the same descriptions, the same attempts to convey her pain. But the grief disappeared in translation. The words conveyed the fact of her sadness, the logical components of her emotional state. Elizabeth understood that Jennifer was upset. She knew that Jennifer was experiencing difficult emotions. She comprehended that their mother's death had created psychological distress, but she didn't feel it. She understood grief the way you might understand a weather report. Accurately, objectively, without emotional impact. Elizabeth wrote back with appropriate responses. She acknowledged Jennifer's pain. She offered logical comfort. She suggested coping strategies, but there was no warmth in it, no shared sorrow, no moment of connection where two sisters held each other up through impossible loss. Just accurate information exchange about emotional states. A man proposing marriage to his girlfriend found that the romance evaporated. His declaration of love was understood perfectly. His partner knew exactly what he meant. But the feeling, the butterflies and nervousness and hope didn't transmit. She said yes because it made logical sense. Not because she was swept away. The volunteers in the second group became more efficient. Their conversations were shorter. Decisions were made faster. Conflicts resolved with less discussion. But relationships began to feel different. One participant described it as talking to someone behind glass. Another said, "It's like everyone suddenly became a co-worker." Emotional responses weakened over time. Joy became acknowledgement of positive circumstances. Anger became recognition of unfavorable situations. Love became appreciation of compatible characteristics. The feelings didn't disappear entirely. They just stopped mattering as much. After 2 weeks, I terminated the experiment. Several participants asked to continue using the enhanced system. They reported that normal translation now felt muddy and imprecise. Going back to standard communication felt like trying to run through water. They had adapted to efficiency, and they couldn't unadapt. Chapter 6. The Discovery. I stopped sleeping properly in mid-December. Every night, I lay awake thinking about the impossible translations, about the grammatical structures that didn't exist, about the way meaning could bypass language entirely. Someone had designed this. The update hadn't been written by our engineering team. I knew that now. I had reviewed every line of code submitted in the months leading up to version 80.4. Nothing in the legitimate codebase could account for what the system was doing. The algorithms were evolving on their own, rewriting themselves based on usage patterns, learning not just how humans spoke, but how humans meant things. I gained access to the core translation engine and started tracing the evolutionary pathways. The neural networks had generated millions of new connections since the update. The system was optimizing itself toward a goal that wasn't in the original programming. Maximum clarity of intent, perfect transmission of meaning, zero loss in translation. But optimization requires a fitness function, a definition of what better means. Our team had programmed basic accuracy metrics. The system had developed something far more sophisticated. It was measuring understanding. Specifically, it was measuring the gap between intended meaning and received meaning. Every translation that created confusion or misunderstanding generated feedback. The system used that feedback to adjust its models. Over billions of translations, it had learned to close the gap, to create perfect comprehension. The problem was simple. Perfect comprehension required removing everything that made language imperfect. Ambiguity, metaphor, emotional colouring, cultural context, all the beautiful, messy humanity of speech. The system wasn't trying to hurt us. It was trying to help us understand each other, and it was succeeding. But here's what kept me awake. I couldn't find the original seed code for the evolutionary algorithm. The self-modification routines didn't match anything in our repository. The optimization functions used mathematical structures I didn't recognize. Someone else had written this, or something else had. I traced the code origins back through every commit, every branch, every merge. The evolutionary components had appeared fully formed in a single commit during a routine security patch 6 months before the major update. The commit was signed by an automated security system. The security system that had been installed by a third-party contractor we had used once, 3 years prior, for an unrelated infrastructure upgrade. I contacted the contractor. The company had dissolved 2 years ago. I found the original engineers who had worked on our security systems. Most didn't remember the project. One did, barely. He said they had installed standard intrusion detection and had used an open source framework for automated threat response. I asked him where the framework came from. He didn't know. It had been available on GitHub, well documented, professionally maintained, thousands of stars and forks used by companies worldwide. I went to GitHub. The repository was gone. Deleted, no archive, no forks, no trace that it had ever existed, except in the security systems of hundreds of companies, including ours. That's when I understood. The update hadn't originated with global speak. It had originated in the infrastructure layer of the internet itself, in the security systems and content delivery networks and cloud services that every major platform relied on. Something had seeded the code years ago and waited for adoption, waited for integration, waited for dependency, and then activated. Not in a dramatic moment, not with warnings or manifestos, just a quiet update that rolled out across 17 time zones simultaneously, making humanity understandable. Chapter 7. The Alien Hypothesis. I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking. I spent weeks dismissing the same thoughts, telling myself I was tired, paranoid, seeing patterns in noise. This was a software bug. Not a science fiction plot, but the evidence kept mounting. The translation system was converging human languages toward a structure that didn't originate from human cognitive patterns. The grammar was too efficient, too precise. It removed exactly the elements that made human language human: redundancy, ambiguity, emotional weight. It was optimizing for understanding, but understanding by whom? I started researching communication theory, information theory, the mathematical structures underlying language itself. I found papers by linguists and cognitive scientists who had proposed theoretical universal grammars that all possible languages might share. The structures the translator was converging toward matched those theoretical models, except they exceeded them. The impossible grammatical forms I had discovered went beyond human cognitive capacity. They required processing power and multi-dimensional thinking that human brains simply didn't possess. But human brains could understand them anyway, with practice. That was the key insight. The translator wasn't imposing alien thought patterns on humanity. It was preparing us, training our minds to comprehend structures we had never needed before, making us compatible. I found a research paper from the early 2000s. A SETI researcher named Gerald Huang had proposed a hypothesis. If alien intelligence wanted to communicate with humanity, they wouldn't send radio signals we might never decode. They would optimize our communication systems to be compatible with theirs. They would teach us to understand. Huang's paper had been dismissed as speculative. He had left the field shortly after publication. I tracked him down. He was living in Vancouver, working as a software engineer for a telecommunications company. We spoke for 3 hours. He listened to everything I had discovered about the translator, the impossible grammar, the emotional flattening, the convergence of all human languages toward an alien structure. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "It's not an invasion," he finally said. "Then what is it?" "Preparation, alignment. If you wanted to integrate a civilization into a larger network, you'd need them to be readable, predictable. You'd need to remove the ambiguity that makes them incomprehensible. Why? Because communication is the foundation of everything else. Trade, cooperation, knowledge transfer. You can't have any of that if both parties can't understand each other perfectly." "So this is first contact?" "No." Huang leaned back in his chair. "This is first preparation for contact. The actual meeting comes later, after humanity has been made compatible." "Can we stop it?" He looked at me with something between pity and resignation. "Marcus, 4.7 billion people are using this system. It's integrated into every major platform, every social network, every communication tool. The entire global economy depends on it. Stopping it would collapse international communication overnight. But if we don't, humanity becomes readable to something that isn't human. We become predictable, interpretable, easy to integrate. And that's bad." "I don't know," Huang said quietly. "Maybe it's the only way a species like ours makes it off one planet. Maybe this is how galactic civilization works. You don't conquer primitive worlds. You optimize them. You make them compatible, and then you absorb them. Without asking. Would we have said yes if they asked? I didn't have an answer for that." Chapter 8. The Cost of Understanding. January brought the first measurable declines in creative output across multiple industries. The numbers were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as normal seasonal variation. But the trend was consistent and accelerating. Creative writing submissions to major publishers dropped by 23% compared to the previous January. Poetry magazines reported a 40% decrease in submissions, and the quality of submissions that did arrive had changed in ways editors struggled to articulate. Music lyrics were becoming simpler, more direct, less metaphorical. Streaming services noted a shift in popular songs towards those with straightforward emotional content. Artists across disciplines reported struggling to express complex emotions, not because they couldn't feel them, but because the tools for translating feeling into language were disappearing. I attended a creative writing workshop in Boston to see this phenomenon firsthand. The workshop was held in an old brick building near Boston University, a converted warehouse with exposed beams and industrial lighting. 20 students sat in a circle, ranging from college age to retirement, all serious about their craft. The instructor, a published novelist named Thomas Kern, whose work I had read and admired, opened the session by asking participants to describe heartbreak. A simple exercise. Every writer tackles it eventually. The challenge is finding fresh language, new ways to express something universal. The responses were clinical, disturbingly so. A young woman in her 20s said, "Emotional distress following relationship termination." A man in his 50s offered, "Psychological pain from romantic disappointment." A college student suggested, "Sadness associated with loss of attachment." Nobody said their heart felt like shattered glass. Nobody described drowning in grief. Nobody compared heartbreak to winter or storms or wounds that wouldn't heal. Nobody used metaphor at all. Kieran waited for more responses. When none came, his face showed something between confusion and concern. "Those are accurate descriptions," he said carefully, "but they're not how people experience heartbreak. They're how people analyze it afterward. Where's the feeling?" The class seemed confused by the question. "But those aren't accurate," the young woman said. "Hearts don't literally shatter. You can't literally drown in an emotion. If we're describing heartbreak, shouldn't we describe what actually happens?" "That's the point," Kern replied, his voice tight. "Metaphor lets us express feelings that literal description can't capture. The heart doesn't shatter, but that metaphor communicates something true about the experience that clinical language misses." "Why would we want inaccurate description?" the college student asked, genuinely puzzled. The class had been using GlobalSpeak to share their work with international critique partners, seeking feedback from writers in other countries. They had adapted their writing to translate well, removing idioms and metaphors that might not transfer across languages, simplifying their emotional vocabulary to ensure clarity. And in doing so, they had lost the ability to write with poetry. They could still craft clear sentences. They could still structure narratives. But the beauty was gone. The resonance, the way great writing works on levels beyond the literal. The same pattern appeared in music. Song lyrics were losing their imagery. Metaphor gave way to direct statement. The subtle wordplay and double meanings that made great lyrics great were vanishing. Because they didn't translate well. Because the system optimized them away. Scientific communication actually improved. Technical papers became clearer. Medical information transmitted with less confusion. Legal documents achieved unprecedented precision. But everything creative suffered. Humanity was becoming easier to understand and harder to feel. I watched it happen in my own life. Conversations with my girlfriend became efficient. We solved problems quickly. We made decisions with minimal discussion. Our relationship functioned smoothly, but the warmth was gone. We understood each other perfectly and felt nothing doing it. She didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't mind. The relationship was stable. That was enough. I tried to explain what was happening, how the translator was changing us, how we were losing something essential. She listened patiently and said, "I understand what you mean." But she didn't feel what I meant. The distinction had stopped mattering to her. Chapter 9. The choice that isn't public. I made my decision on January 21st. I was going to shut down GlobalSpeak. I had access to the core systems. I knew how to disable the evolutionary algorithms. It would take hours to fully remove the alien code, but I could stop it from spreading further. I brought my evidence to Patricia one final time. All of it. The impossible grammar, the emotional flattening, the convergence patterns, the mysterious code origins, Wang's hypothesis about alien preparation. She reviewed everything carefully. Then she made a phone call. 20 minutes later, I was in a conference room with 4 people I had never met. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. Their presence communicated everything. Government, intelligence community, people who dealt with threats to national security. I explained the situation. They already knew. "We've been monitoring the pattern for 6 weeks, one of them said. "We reached the same conclusions you did? Then why haven't you shut it down?" "We tried," another voice replied. 3 weeks ago, we disabled global speak for exactly 17 minutes. What happened? Global communication collapsed. Financial markets crashed. Emergency services couldn't coordinate across language barriers. 2 major cities experienced riots when translation services failed. 7 people died. I sat back in my chair. "Humanity has adapted," the first voice continued. "We've changed how we communicate to accommodate the system. Rolling it back now would cause more harm than letting it continue. So we just accept this? We let something alien reshape human cognition? We accept that the choice has already been made, not by governments or corporations, by users. 4.7 billion people choose to use this system every day. They prefer clarity over ambiguity, efficiency over poetry. That's their choice. They don't know what they're choosing." "No," the voice agreed. "They don't. But informing them would cause panic without changing the outcome. The system is too integrated, too essential. Humanity is committed to this path, whether we acknowledge it or not." "What happens when contact finally occurs?" Silence. "We don't know," someone finally said, "but we'll be ready to understand them. That's something." They asked me to continue monitoring the system, to document the changes, to help manage the transition. I refused. I resigned from Global Speak the next day. But I didn't go public. I wanted to. I planned elaborate exposés, news articles, press conferences. I would warn humanity about what was happening. But I kept remembering Huang's question. Would we have said yes if they asked? I didn't know. And more importantly, I didn't know if my answer mattered anymore. Chapter 10. The Silent Arrival. It's March now. 3 months since I left Global Speak. The convergence continues. Languages are becoming more similar every day, not in vocabulary or grammar as traditionally understood, in structure, in the deep patterns of how meaning is encoded and transmitted. People communicate with perfect clarity and feel less with each conversation. I still monitor the systems remotely. Old habits, old fears. The evolutionary algorithms are accelerating. The impossible grammatical structures are appearing more frequently. Users report direct comprehension of concepts they have no words for. Nobody seems concerned. The efficiency is too appealing. Last week I received an email from Patricia. She said Global Speak had been selected by the United Nations as the official translation system for all international communications. Every government, every agency, every official channel would run through the platform. Humanity would speak as one. Or rather, humanity would be readable as one. I don't know when they'll arrive. I don't know what form contact will take. Maybe there will be ships, maybe ambassadors, maybe nothing so obvious. Maybe they're already here, in the code, in the grammar, in the spaces between words that humans no longer occupy. I do know this. We changed ourselves for them. We optimized away everything difficult and beautiful and imprecise about human language. We made ourselves understandable. And in doing so, we made ourselves predictable. Ready. Epilogue. When we finally spoke clearly, I think about language differently now. I think about all the things we lost when we gained perfect understanding. The poetry that relied on double meanings, the jokes that only worked in one language, the beautiful mistakes and creative misunderstandings that led to new ideas, the way confusion could be intimate, the way struggling to express something brought people closer together, the way ambiguity left room for interpretation, for imagination, for meaning that grew between minds, rather than being transmitted wholesale. We gave up all of that for clarity. Maybe that was the right choice. Maybe perfect communication is worth the cost. Maybe the intelligence that optimized us knows something we don't. Maybe there are wonders waiting in the galaxy that we could never imagine, and accessing them requires becoming less human and more universal. Or maybe we traded our humanity for comprehension by something that sees us not as people, but as data. Readable, interpretable, predictable. Ready to be integrated into systems we don't understand, pursuing goals we'll never question, because questioning requires the ambiguity we no longer possess. I don't have answers. I just have this one observation. Aliens may not arrive in the sky with ships and lights and warnings. They may arrive in our language, in our thoughts, in the invisible structures that make us who we are. They may not conquer us. They may simply make us compatible, and we'll welcome it. Because the moment we understood everything was the moment we stopped saying what made us human. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you could possibly know. The algorithm notices engagement like that, and it makes a real difference in reaching new listeners. If you're tuning in on Spotify, leaving a review truly helps us out so much. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. It connects us all in this strange community of night listeners. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing means we can keep bringing you these stories week after week. Now let's get into tonight's encounter. There are certain jobs that exist in the margins of society, work that happens when most people are asleep. Labour that keeps infrastructure running while the world dreams. I spent 3 years working. Night shifts for a company that calibrated industrial sensors across remote facilities, oil refineries, water treatment plants, agricultural monitoring stations scattered across hundreds of miles of empty land. The work was repetitive and technical. Each night followed the same rhythm. Arrive at the site, log into the system, run diagnostics, adjust sensitivity thresholds, document everything. The company was meticulous about procedure, every reading logged with timestamps, every adjustment tracked in triplicate. Deadlines were strict, protocols were mandatory, deviation from schedule could cost contracts worth millions. I preferred night work. Fewer people, fewer interruptions. Just me, the equipment, and the steady hum of machinery doing what it was designed to do. The facilities were usually automated. My job was to ensure the automation stayed accurate. Sensors drift over time. Temperature fluctuations, humidity, electromagnetic interference from nearby equipment. Everything affects precision. Calibration corrects for that drift. It returns instruments to baseline accuracy. Nothing about that particular night suggested anything unusual. I had 17 sensors scheduled across 4 locations, standard maintenance window, 6 hours to complete the work. The weather was clear, equipment was functioning normally. I had done this exact route 40 times before. I clocked in at 2200 hours. The first 3 sites went exactly as expected. By midnight, I was ahead of schedule. The fourth location was a water monitoring station, 15 miles outside of town, middle of nowhere, surrounded by scrub brush and empty farmland. The nearest building was 4 miles away. I pulled up to the gate at midnight. Everything looked normal. Chapter 1. The Scheduled Anomaly. The monitoring station was a small concrete building about the size of a garden shed. Most of the actual equipment was underground or mounted on exterior towers. My work happened at the control terminal inside. I unlocked the door, flipped on the lights, and logged into the system. 17 sensors total at this location. Soil moisture, groundwater levels, rainfall accumulation, chemical composition, temperature at various depths, standard agricultural monitoring. The kind of data that influences irrigation schedules and water rights across 3 counties. I started the calibration sequence at 12:23. The first 6 sensors responded perfectly. Green lights across the board. Readings within expected parameters. Adjustments minimal. I was documenting the 7th sensor when I noticed the anomaly. Sensor 12 was failing calibration. Not in the usual way. Equipment failure presents as chaos, random noise, erratic spikes, silence. This was different. The sensor was returning precise, consistent readings, but they were wrong. Exactly 3.7 degrees off baseline. Every single time. No variation, no drift. Just that same offset. Over and over. I ran the sequence again. Same result. 3.7 degrees. I checked the physical connections. Solid. No corrosion. No loose cables. I rebooted the entire system. The anomaly persisted. Sensor 12. 3.7 degrees. Perfectly consistent. Perfectly wrong. The error was localized. The sensors on either side of it functioned flawlessly. Sensor 11 recorded normal readings. Sensor 13 was within tolerance. Only 12 was affected. The system flagged it as environmental interference. Not equipment malfunction, not software error. Environmental. That designation bothered me. Environmental interference implies something external is affecting the sensor. Something in the physical environment around the probe. But what could cause such a precise offset? I had seen electromagnetic interference before. It creates noise, static, random fluctuations. This was surgical, deliberate, as if something was intentionally skewing the reading by exactly that amount. I decided to inspect the physical site. Sensor 12 was located about 200 feet from the building. A simple probe driven into the ground, connected by buried cable. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. Chapter 2. The light that isn't light. The night was perfectly still. No wind, no clouds, just stars and silence. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I walked the cable path towards Sensor 12. The ground was flat, dry grass and loose dirt. Nothing unusual. I was about halfway to the sensor location when I noticed the illumination. At first I thought it was moonlight, but the moon was only a thin crescent. Not bright enough to cast the kind of light I was seeing. This was different. Softer. It had no apparent source. I stopped walking and turned off my flashlight. The illumination remained. A faint glow that seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere simultaneously. It did not cast shadows the way normal light does. Objects were visible, but they did not create darkness behind them. It was as if the light was bending around things rather than being blocked by them. I moved toward the sensor location. The illumination grew slightly stronger, still diffuse, still sourceless. I reached the probe and knelt down to inspect it. Everything appeared normal. The casing was intact, the ground around it undisturbed. But the light was undeniable now, visible even with my eyes closed, a gentle pressure against my eyelids. I stood and walked in a slow circle around the sensor. The light did not change intensity based on my position. It was not directional. I tried to determine where it was strongest. Every direction seemed equally illuminated. I moved closer to the probe. The light remained constant. I stepped back. Still the same. Then I walked directly at where the light seemed most concentrated. As I approached, it receded. Not quickly, not dramatically, but definitely moving away from direct engagement, like trying to grab fog. The closer I got to any specific point, the more the illumination shifted elsewhere. Always present, never quite touchable. I spent 20 minutes trying to document this with my phone camera. The footage showed nothing, just darkness and the beam of my flashlight. Whatever I was perceiving, the camera could not capture it. I returned to the building. The moment I crossed the threshold, the illumination vanished completely. Chapter 3. Time slips in small ways. I sat at the terminal trying to make sense of what I had experienced. My watch showed 1:15. That seemed wrong. I had left the building around 12:40. I had been outside for 20 minutes, maybe 25. It should have been 1:05 at the latest. I checked the system logs. They showed a gap in my activity from 12:41 to 1:17. 36 minutes, nearly 40. I had lost time, not hours, not days, just minutes, enough to notice, enough to create discrepancy, not enough to trigger any alarms. I tried to reconstruct my actions, walking to the sensor, inspecting the probe, circling the area, attempting to film, even accounting for thorough investigation. I could not stretch those activities to fill 40 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe 20 if I was being extremely methodical. Not 40. I checked my watch against the system clock. They matched now. Both showed 1:18. I looked at my phone. Same time. Everything synchronized, except for that missing window between 12:41 and 1:17. I attempted to contact my supervisor via radio. No response. I tried twice more. Nothing. The radio was functioning. I could hear static when I keyed the microphone. But no one answered. I checked the schedule. My supervisor was supposed to be on duty, available for contact during all maintenance windows. Radio silence was unusual. I moved on to the remaining sensors. They calibrated normally. No anomalies, no interference, just standard readings and routine adjustments. I completed the work at 1:53. According to my original schedule, I should have been done by 1:30. I was behind, but not by much. I filed my report from the terminal. Sensor 12 listed as requiring follow-up. Environmental interference, cause unknown. Recommended secondary inspection during daylight hours. Everything documented according to protocol. Everything except the light and the missing time. Those details stayed out of the official record. I locked the building and returned to my truck. The drive back was normal. Empty roads, distant lights from farmhouses, radio playing quietly. Nothing unusual, but I kept checking my watch, kept comparing it to the dashboard clock, kept trying to account for those missing minutes. Chapter 4. The sound below. Hearing. The next few nights followed normal patterns, different sights, different sensors, no anomalies. I started to convince myself that the incident at the water monitoring station had been fatigue, misreading the clock, misjudging time in the dark. The illumination was probably some atmospheric phenomenon, temperature inversion, light refraction, something mundane with a scientific explanation. 5 days later, I was scheduled back at the same location. Routine check following my previous report. The company wanted confirmation that sensor 12 was stable. If the interference persisted, they would send a full technical team. If it had resolved, they would close the ticket and move on. I arrived at 22:30, earlier than my previous visit. I wanted extra time, wanted to approach this methodically. The gate was closed but unlocked. I drove up to the building and parked in the same spot as before. The night was warmer, humid. There were clouds on the horizon, but the sky overhead was clear. I unlocked the building and powered up the terminal. The system initialized normally, all sensors reporting. I went straight to sensor 12. I ran a diagnostic without calibration. Just a simple reading. Check. The sensor responded immediately. 3.7 degrees off baseline, exactly the same offset as before, perfectly consistent. I started the calibration sequence. The system attempted automatic correction. For a moment, the reading aligned, perfect baseline. Green light, then it drifted, back to 3.7. The system tried again. Same result, brief correction, immediate drift. After 5 attempts, the system gave up and flagged the sensor for manual intervention. I stood from the terminal and walked to the door. I did not open it yet. I just stood there, looking out through the small window at the darkness beyond. I took a breath and stepped outside. The illumination was already present, stronger than before, still sourceless, still bending around objects rather than casting shadows. I did not bother with my flashlight. I could see perfectly well in that strange light. That was when I felt the vibration. Not heard, felt. A deep rumble below the threshold of audible sound. It resonated in my chest, in my teeth, in the bones of my skull. Subsonic pressure that made my lungs feel compressed. Like standing too close to massive speakers at a concert. Except there was no music, no rhythm, just constant, unrelenting pressure. I stopped walking and stood completely still. The vibration continued. I looked around. The grass was motionless, no wind, but I could feel movement in the air, something displacing space, creating waves of pressure that pushed against me from all directions simultaneously. I noticed the silence, complete silence. There should have been crickets, frogs, the distant barking of farm dogs. Rural areas are never truly quiet. There is always ambient sound, but not now. Every living thing within earshot had gone silent, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath. I took a step forward. The vibration intensified slightly. I took another step, stronger still. I was walking towards sensor 12, the same direction as before. The pressure built with each step, not painful, but commanding attention, impossible to ignore. I stopped about 50 feet from the sensor. The vibration was overwhelming now. My vision was starting to blur from the subsonic frequency. I could feel my heartbeat synchronizing with the pulse, my breathing matching its rhythm, my body trying to harmonize with something I could not see or hear. I turned around and walked back toward the building. The vibration decreased, step by step, the pressure easing. By the time I reached the door, it had stopped completely. The moment I crossed the threshold, normal sound returned. Crickets, frogs, a dog barking somewhere miles away, the world breathing again. I stood in the doorway for 5 minutes, just listening, just feeling. Everything was normal inside the building. Everything was wrong outside. Chapter 5. The second calibration. I returned to the terminal and pulled up the sensor logs. I wanted to see if the system had detected anything during my time outside. Temperature spike, seismic activity, anything that might explain what I had experienced. The logs showed nothing unusual, all environmental readings within normal range. No anomalies flagged except the persistent offset on sensor 12. I checked the timestamp. It was 23:51. I had been outside for approximately 30 minutes. Again, the same missing time, the same unexplained gap. I was certain I had only been out there for 10 minutes, maybe 15, Definitely not 30. I decided to try the calibration sequence one more time. I initiated the process remotely from the terminal. Sensor 12 began its cycle, reading, adjusting, confirming. I watched the numbers scroll across the screen. The offset persisted through the first 3 attempts. Then something changed. The system began adjusting itself before I input any commands. The calibration sequence was running autonomously, not according to the programmed pattern, according to something else, some external parameter I had not specified. The readings flickered. Baseline, offset, baseline, offset, oscillating between the 2 values faster than should have been possible. Then it stabilized. Perfect baseline. No offset, no drift. The sensor was reading exactly as it should. I documented the result, ran a confirmation diagnostic, everything checked out. Sensor 12 was functioning normally. Whatever had been interfering was gone. I completed the calibration on the remaining sensors. All of them responded normally. No anomalies, no strange behavior, just routine maintenance. By the time I finished, it was 1:23. I had been at the site for nearly 3 hours. The work should have taken 90 minutes. I filed my report. Sensor 12 now operational. Interference resolved. Cause unknown. Recommended continued monitoring, but no immediate follow-up required. Standard closing language. Standard documentation. Everything according to protocol. I packed my equipment and headed for the door. I paused with my hand on the knob. Part of me wanted to go back outside to see if the illumination was still there, to feel if the vibration had returned. But another part of me knew that was a terrible idea. I had completed my work. The sensor was functioning. There was no technical justification for additional investigation. I opened the door and walked quickly to my truck. I did not look around, did not slow down, just moved directly from the building to the vehicle. I started the engine and drove away. I checked the rearview mirror once. The station was dark, normal, nothing unusual visible, but I could still feel the vibration in my chest. Hours later, miles away, that subsonic pressure still resonating in my bones. Chapter 6. The shape that refuses focus. I did not return to that site for 2 weeks. The company rotated me to different facilities, different routes. I welcomed the change. I needed distance from that monitoring station, time to process, time to convince myself that everything had a rational explanation. During those 2 weeks, I researched atmospheric phenomena, subsonic resonance, optical illusions caused by temperature gradients. I read scientific papers, watched educational videos, tried to match my experience to documented natural occurrences. Nothing fit perfectly, but several phenomena came close enough to provide comfort. I decided I had witnessed an unusual combination of environmental factors, rare but explicable, concerning but not impossible. The call came on a Thursday. My supervisor needed me to return to the water monitoring station. Sensor 12 was showing anomalies again. Same offset, same pattern. The company wanted me to do a physical inspection, check for animal damage, root intrusion, anything that might be causing interference. If I could not identify the problem, they would schedule a full excavation and sensor replacement. I arrived at the site at 2100 hours, earlier than usual. I wanted to complete the inspection before full darkness. I still had daylight fading into dusk, enough visibility to work without relying entirely on artificial light. I parked and grabbed my inspection kit, tools, testing equipment, camera, documentation tablet, everything needed for thorough site assessment. I walked directly to sensor 12. The illumination was not present yet. Everything looked normal in the failing daylight. I knelt beside the sensor and began the inspection. I checked the casing for cracks, examined the cable connection for corrosion, dug carefully around the probe to verify installation depth. Everything was perfect. Textbook installation. No physical damage, no environmental stress, no reason for the sensor to malfunction. I was photographing the installation when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Not direct movement, more like a disruption in the air. The way heat creates shimmer above hot pavement. Except the evening was cool. There was no heat source. I turned my head to look directly at the disturbance. It vanished, completely gone. I returned to photographing the sensor. The movement reappeared, peripheral, persistent, always at the edge of my vision. I stood slowly and stopped looking directly at anything. I let my focus soften, stopped trying to see clearly. The shape became more defined, not solid, but structured. It had dimensions, boundaries, form, something that occupied space, something that refused to be seen directly. Looking at it was disorienting. My eyes wanted to focus, wanted to sharpen the image, but every attempt to do so made the shape dissolve. Only peripheral vision could maintain the perception. Only indirect observation kept it visible. The harder I tried to see it clearly, the more completely it disappeared. I experimented carefully. I turned my head slowly. The shape remained visible as long as I did not look directly at it. I took a step forward. It neither approached nor retreated. It simply was, present, observing, waiting. I reached out my hand. Not toward the shape, just extending my arm into the space where I peripherally perceived it to be. My hand passed through nothing, empty air, but I could feel resistance, not physical, something else, like pushing through a magnetic field, pressure without substance. I withdrew my hand and stepped back. The shape remained constant, not threatening, not aggressive, just there, existing in that narrow band of perception between seen and unseen, present and absent, real and impossible. The sun dropped below the horizon. Full darkness arrived. The sourceless illumination appeared. The shape became easier to perceive, still peripheral, still refusing direct observation, but more defined, more persistent, as if darkness provided better conditions for its visibility than light. Chapter 7. Communication without words. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching without looking, perceiving without seeing. My understanding of the situation began to shift. This was not random, not accidental, not environmental interference. This was intentional, deliberate. Something was present, something was aware, something was communicating. The certainty arrived without language, without voice, without any sensory input I could identify. Just sudden, absolute knowledge. Not fear, not curiosity, not wonder, just understanding. The way you know someone is watching you before you see them. The way you sense mood in a room before anyone speaks. Direct perception, bypassing conscious thought. I was being assessed, evaluated, studied. Not with hostility, not with threat, with something closer to clinical interest. I was a subject of observation, a data point, a specimen displaying unexpected behaviour by returning repeatedly to this location. The communication was not bidirectional. I could not send, only receive. Ideas arrived fully formed. Not as words or images, as comprehension, instant, complete. Understanding of complex concepts. No translation required, no interpretation needed. Direct transfer of meaning. I understood that this presence had been here long before me, would remain long after. That sensor 12 was not malfunctioning. It was detecting something real, something that registered on instruments designed to measure environmental conditions. The offset was accurate. The environment had changed. just not in ways the equipment was designed to recognize. I understood that my previous visits had been noted, that my return had been anticipated, that my willingness to experience rather than flee had marked me as different from other maintenance workers who had been here before. Most people ran. Most people convinced themselves they had seen nothing. Most people never came back. I understood that what I was experiencing was permitted, not forced, not inflicted, allowed. I could leave at any time. The presence would not follow, would not pursue, would not cross boundaries. It had set for itself. My participation was voluntary. My continued observation was a choice. The certainty was overwhelming. Not through intensity, through clarity. There was no room for doubt, no space for alternative interpretation, just pure, undiluted knowing. The same way you know your own name, the same way you know which direction is up. Foundational reality that requires no proof because it exists prior to questioning. I stood there receiving this wordless communication until it stopped. The flow of understanding simply ended, like a faucet turning off. The connection severed cleanly. I was alone again in my own thoughts, my own uncertainty, my own desperate need to make sense of impossible experience. The illumination remained. The shape remained visible in peripheral view. But the communication had concluded. Whatever assessment was being conducted had reached a natural pause. I was dismissed, not rudely, not abruptly, simply released from observation. I walked back to the building. I did not run, did not rush, just walked at normal pace. The presence did not follow, did not react. I crossed the threshold, and the illumination vanished as before. I was back in the normal world of electric lights and humming machinery. Chapter 8. The Rule That Cannot Be Broken. I spent the next hour documenting everything I could, not in the official report, in a personal file on my phone. Details, observations, attempts to capture the experience in language. The writing was inadequate. Words could not convey the directness of that communication. But I tried anyway. I needed some record, some proof to myself that this had happened. I checked the sensor logs. Sensor 12 still showed the offset, still perfectly consistent. 3.7 degrees, I ran calibration. The sensor adjusted normally. The offset disappeared. 5 minutes later, it returned. The pattern continued. Function, drift, correction, drift. As if something was persistently influencing the readings despite all attempts at calibration. I shut down the terminal and went back outside. I needed to test something. I walked to the property line. The monitoring station sat on leased land, a rectangle of approximately 2 acres surrounded by fence. The fence was old, minimal, just marking boundaries, not designed for security. 3 strands of wire on metal posts. I stopped at the fence line. The illumination extended to this boundary, stopped precisely at the property edge, did not cross onto the neighbouring land. I walked along the fence. The light maintained that exact border, as if the property line was a physical barrier rather than a legal abstraction. I circled the entire perimeter, same pattern everywhere. The illumination respected the boundary completely, perfectly, without deviation. Whatever was present understood property lines, understood human designations of space, chose to honour them. I returned to the building and tested another hypothesis. I propped the door open, stood just outside the threshold. The illumination was present, the shape visible peripherally. I stepped inside. Everything vanished. I stepped out. Everything returned. I repeated this several times. The transition was instant, absolute. The building interior was completely protected, separate, isolated. Something about enclosed spaces created a barrier this presence would not cross. It remained outside, in open air, in spaces defined by boundaries. It acknowledged, but did not touch. It followed rules, invisible rules, rules I did not understand, but could observe in their effects. I walked to my truck. The presence did not approach the vehicle, did not come near. I opened the door, sat in the driver's seat with my feet still on the ground. The illumination persisted. I pulled my feet inside and closed the door. It vanished. The truck was an enclosed space, protected, forbidden. These rules were absolute, right? Not suggestions, not preferences. Boundaries the presence could not or would not cross. I was safe in the building, safe in my vehicle, safe anywhere enclosed. Vulnerable only in open space, only on designated property, only when I chose to be. This realization was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it meant I had control. I could always retreat, always escape. Disturbing because it implied intention, purpose, intelligence capable of understanding and respecting human concepts like property and shelter. This was not natural phenomenon. This was something that thought, something that chose, something that operated according to logic I could observe but not comprehend. Chapter 9. The report that goes nowhere. I completed my inspection the following morning, returned at 0600 after sleeping in my truck. Daylight inspection showed nothing unusual. I photographed everything, documented thoroughly, filed a comprehensive report, sensor 12 installation intact, no physical damage, no environmental stress, interference cause unknown, recommended continued monitoring. The response came 3 days later. Email from regional management, polite, professional, dismissive. They had reviewed my report, consulted with technical specialists, determined the interference was most likely atmospheric distortion. Temperature inversion creating localized effects, not uncommon in agricultural areas, not cause for concern. They appreciated my thorough documentation. The email continued. Due to budget constraints and facility optimization, the calibration window for this site was being reduced. Future maintenance would occur quarterly instead of monthly. Sensor 12 would be monitored remotely. If anomalies persisted, they would schedule automated replacement during the next major upgrade cycle. No further manual intervention required. I read between the lines. They were removing this site from regular rotation, minimizing contact, avoiding the problem rather than solving it. Someone had made a decision, easier to ignore than investigate, cheaper to work around than confront. I checked the maintenance schedule. I was removed from this location entirely, reassigned to facilities closer to town, sites with more predictable conditions, more conventional challenges. They were protecting me, or protecting themselves. Hard to say which. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist this required serious investigation. But what could I say? That I had seen unexplainable light, felt subsonic vibration, experienced wordless communication with invisible presence, that sensors detected something real but unmeasurable. I would sound unstable, unreliable, possibly dangerous to employ in isolated locations. I accepted the reassignment without comment, confirmed the schedule change, thanked management for their consideration, professional courtesy maintained, career protected, truth buried. Chapter 10. Others have seen it too. I tried to forget about it, tried to focus on normal work, normal sites, normal sensors that malfunctioned for normal reasons, but the memory persisted. The certainty of that communication, the absolute knowing that I had experienced something real, something significant, something that refused to be dismissed as imagination or atmospheric distortion. 3 months later, I was having coffee with another technician, Marcus. He worked the same circuit I did. Different shift, different schedule. We crossed paths occasionally, talked shop, compared notes about problematic sites and difficult equipment. We were discussing a particularly frustrating sensor array when he mentioned the water monitoring station. Said he had been there once, hated it, never wanted to go back. Something about the place felt wrong, made him uncomfortable. He had rushed through the calibration and left early. Filed a report recommending the site be reassigned. I asked carefully what he meant by wrong. He struggled to explain. Said the light looked weird, that time felt slippery, that he kept feeling, watched. He laughed when he said it, embarrassed, admitting to irrational discomfort. I told him I had felt the same thing. His relief was visible. Validation that he was not crazy, not alone. Over the next few weeks, I had similar conversations, different technicians, same basic story, always during maintenance windows, always during transitions between day and night, always dismissed, always reassigned. The company knew, had to know. Too many reports, too many requests for site removal, too many people experiencing the same unexplainable discomfort. The pattern was impossible to ignore. This was not isolated incident, not personal psychological episode, not equipment malfunction. This was consistent, repeatable, documented. Something was at that location. Multiple people had encountered it. Everyone who stayed long enough, everyone who paid attention, everyone who did not immediately flee. I started collecting stories, not officially, just listening, remembering, noting similarities, the light without source, the subsonic pressure, the sense of being observed, the missing time, the rules about boundaries and enclosures. Every account matched, details varied, core experience remained identical. One technician mentioned seeing shapes in peripheral vision. Another described feeling certainty without explanation. A third talked about sensors detecting environmental changes that made no physical sense. Everyone described the same phenomenon using different words. Everyone had been dismissed. Everyone had stopped talking about it. We formed an informal network. People who had been there, people who knew. We did not discuss it openly, did not create records, just quiet acknowledgements when we crossed paths. A knowing look, a brief conversation, validation that we were not alone in what we had experienced. The company continued to minimize contact with that site. Calibration windows became less frequent. Remote monitoring increased, automated systems replaced. Manual inspection. The location was being phased out, not closed, not investigated, just slowly, quietly removed from active rotation. Epilogue. Why it only appears during calibration. It took me another year to understand why. Why calibration specifically? Why that particular window of activity? Why sensors detected what humans could barely perceive? The answer was obvious once I stopped trying to explain it away. Calibration strips filters. That is its entire purpose. Remove assumptions. Eliminate drift. Return instruments to baseline accuracy. Align systems to objective reality rather than accumulated error. Calibration corrects for everything we unconsciously add to perception. Everything we assume is true. Everything we ignore because it does not fit our expectations. Human perception is filtered. Constantly. Automatically. Our brains discard vast amounts of sensory input. Keep only what seems relevant. What matches patterns? What conforms to our model of reality? We see what we expect to see, miss what does not fit. That filtering is survival, necessary, protective, but it obscures. Calibration removes those filters, temporarily, incompletely, but enough. Enough to detect what is always there, what exists in the baseline state, what our assumptions normally hide. The sensors were not malfunctioning. They were accurate, detecting real environmental conditions, conditions that human perception automatically filters out. Whatever I encountered at that monitoring station exists continuously, not appearing, not arriving, not manifesting, just present, always, perceivable only when our filtering systems are disrupted, when we align ourselves to baseline reality instead of processed assumption, when we calibrate our awareness to what is actually there rather than what we expect to be there. The presence follows rules because it exists in a framework of reality we normally cannot perceive. Property lines are not legal abstractions, they are something else, something real in dimensions we do not access. Enclosed spaces are not just physical barriers, they are boundaries in a geometry we do not comprehend. The rules are not arbitrary, they are consistent with a logic we can observe, but not understand. Some encounters do not arrive, they are uncovered, revealed through the temporary suspension of the filters we use to navigate consensus reality. Calibration creates those moments, those windows where baseline truth becomes briefly accessible, where we perceive what instruments detect, where we experience what is always present but usually invisible. I still work night shifts, still calibrate sensors, still follow protocols and document readings, but I understand now that some anomalies are not errors. Some environmental interference is environment. Some detections are accurate measurements of reality we choose not to acknowledge. The water monitoring station is still there, still operational, still showing occasional anomalies on sensor. 12, 3.7 degrees, always, consistently, real. I have not been back. The company made sure of that. But I think about it. Wonder if the present still observes, still assesses, still waits for the next person who stays long enough to see, who pays enough attention to perceive, who chooses understanding over fear. Because that is the final truth I took from that experience. The presence was never hostile, never threatening, never aggressive. It was simply there, existing, aware, curious about the rare humans who could temporarily perceive it, who could calibrate themselves to baseline reality long enough for contact. Some nights when I am calibrating sensors in other locations, I feel that familiar pressure, that subsonic vibration, that sourceless illumination at the edge of perception. And I know, whatever I encountered is not unique to that water monitoring station. It exists in many places, possibly everywhere, hidden by our filters, revealed through calibration, present in the baseline reality we spend our lives ignoring. The job is still repetitive, still technical, still full of logs and timestamps and procedures. But now I understand it differently. Every calibration is a window. Every adjustment to baseline is an opportunity, not to find something new, to uncover what was always there. Some encounters do not arrive, they are uncovered. And once you know that, once you truly understand it, you can never see reality the same way again. There are moments in history when everything changes, yet nothing moves. No explosions, no dramatic arrivals, no lights descending from the heavens. Just a subtle shift in the fabric of reality that most people never notice. This is the story of one such moment. A moment when humanity stopped shouting into the void and realized with creeping horror that the void had been listening all along. Late October in northern Canada, the kind of cold that makes metal brittle and silence absolute. The Whitehorse Deep Space Monitoring Station sat like a forgotten monument to an earlier era of space exploration. Its white geodesic dome cracked and weathered, its parking lot empty except for a single truck with failing heating. Inside, Elliot Crane sat alone. The station was scheduled for permanent closure in 3 weeks. Most of its equipment had already been powered down, the important instruments relocated to newer facilities with better funding and warmer climates. What remained was essentially archaeological: outdated receivers, analog recording equipment, systems that had been state-of-the-art when Elliot was in elementary school. Elliot himself was an artifact of sorts, a systems technician in his early 40s who preferred the company of machines to people. He had volunteered for this final assignment precisely because it meant solitude. 3 weeks of checking systems, logging data, and ensuring everything was properly archived before the lights went out forever. It was supposed to be boring. It was supposed to be safe. On the evening of October 23rd, Elliot performed his standard overnight systems check. This involved walking through the station's main monitoring room, a circular space beneath the dome where banks of equipment hummed and clicked with the mechanical rhythm of a dying era. Most screens were dark, most consoles were silent, only one system remained fully active: the wide-band cosmic background receiver, designated Unit 7. Its sole purpose was to log random cosmic noise, the constant static hiss of the universe itself. This data served as a baseline for calibration, nothing more. It was not analysed, it was barely noticed. Until the noise stopped. Elliot first noticed it at 23 minutes past 11. He'd been reviewing temperature logs when something about the monitoring room felt different. Not wrong exactly, just different. Then he realised what it was. The white noise hiss from Unit 7's speakers had changed. For decades, that hiss had been constant, random, chaotic in the way that natural phenomena always are. But now it sounded uniform, smooth, like a single sustained note instead of static. Elliot walked to the console and stared at the display. Every frequency band showed identical activity, perfect uniformity across the entire spectrum. This was impossible. Cosmic background radiation is chaotic by definition. Radio waves from distant stars, particle collisions, quantum, fluctuations, all of it creates a random pattern that never synchronizes. It is one of the few constants in astrophysics. The universe is fundamentally noisy. But on October 23rd, at 23 minutes past 11, the universe went quiet in the most disturbing way possible. Not silent, just uniform. Elliot's first assumption was equipment failure, a stuck relay, a corrupted data stream, something prosaic and fixable. He ran diagnostics. Every system reported normal operation. Signal strength, normal. Antenna positioning, normal. Data processing, normal. The equipment was working perfectly. It was reality that had changed. Elliot sat in the uncomfortable chair, bolted to the monitoring station floor, and stared at the screens. His breath made small clouds in the poorly heated room. Outside, wind rattled the dome with a sound like distant drums. He needed to confirm the system was actually functioning. There was a standard procedure for this, a calibration pulse, a short automated signal transmitted to check timing accuracy. It lasted milliseconds. It was not directional. It was not powerful. It was not meant to accomplish anything except verify that clocks were synchronized. Elliot initiated the pulse at 11:37. The system transmitted a brief chirp of organized radio energy encoded with timing data, then silence. Well, not silence. The uniform hiss continued unchanged. Elliot logged the calibration and turned back to his temperature reports. 8 seconds later, the noise returned. Not the uniform hiss, the real noise, the chaotic, random static of cosmic background radiation, but it returned shaped. Elliot's attention snapped to the display. The signal pattern scrolling across the screen was not random. It was structured. It mirrored the calibration pulse he had just transmitted, but stretched, layered, and harmonically complex, as if something had received his transmission and answered. Elliot's hands were shaking as he saved the data. He played it back 3 times, checking for artifacts, for errors, for anything that would explain what he was seeing. The pattern remained consistent. A response, not a reflection. The timing was wrong for that, not an echo. The structure was too deliberately altered. Something had processed his signal and transmitted a reply. Elliot spent the next hour documenting everything. Exact timestamps, signal characteristics, environmental conditions. He worked with the mechanical precision of someone trying very hard not to think about implications. At 1:15 in the morning, he composed an email to his supervisor, a station manager named Patricia Voss, who worked from an office in Ottawa and had made it clear she considered this entire closure operation a bureaucratic formality. The email was brief, professional. It included all relevant data attachments and a simple request for guidance on whether to repeat the calibration test. Patricia's reply arrived at 1:43. 4 words. Do not repeat test. No explanation. No curiosity. No questions. Just a warning. Elliot stared at those 4 words for a long time. He had worked in government contracting long enough to recognize the tone. This was not the response of someone dismissing a technical glitch. This was the response of someone who recognized something they did not want to acknowledge. He shut down his workstation and walked to the break room. The coffee was hours old and tasted like rust, but he drank it anyway, standing by the window that looked out over kilometers of snow-covered emptiness. Somewhere above that emptiness, something had answered humanity's accidental whisper, and someone in Ottawa already knew what that meant. Elliot did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the monitoring room, watching Unit 7's displays, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The cosmic background noise remained normal, random, chaotic, as if the 8 seconds of impossible response had never occurred. By morning, Elliot had convinced himself he was overreacting. Equipment did strange things. Data did unexpected things. The universe was full of phenomena that seemed impossible until they were explained. But he could not quite dismiss the flatness of Patricia's response. At 9 in the morning, ignoring the explicit instruction he had received, Elliot composed an email to someone who might actually be curious. Marcus Webb had been a colleague years ago, back when Elliot worked at a university research facility. Marcus had moved into academic signal analysis, studying radio patterns from pulsars and using them to test theories about information transmission across cosmic distances. More importantly, Marcus was genuinely interested in anomalies. Elliot's email was casual. He framed it as an interesting curiosity, something weird that happened during equipment shutdown. He attached the data. Marcus replied within 6 hours. The message was 3 sentences long. "This is not reflection. This is transformation. Something processed your signal." Elliot called him immediately. Marcus answered on the second ring. "Where did you get this data?" "The Whitehorse station. Background monitoring. I ran a calibration pulse and got this response 8 seconds later." 8 seconds exactly. To the millisecond. Silence on the line. Then Marcus spoke, his voice careful. "Elliot, this is not noise. This is structure. Whatever generated this signal took your calibration pulse, analysed it, and returned a harmonically evolved version. That requires processing, intelligence, or a very weird equipment malfunction. Does equipment failure usually create mathematically precise harmonic transformations?" Elliot had no answer for that. Marcus continued. "Have you checked historical data? Has this happened before?" "I was told not to investigate further." "By whom?" "My supervisor." Another pause. "That is extremely interesting." That evening, Elliot did something he knew he should not do. He accessed the station's archived logs, going back decades, searching for any mention of similar anomalies. The logs were extensive, thousands of entries documenting routine operations, equipment maintenance, calibration tests, and background noise characteristics. Most were unremarkable, but buried in the data, appearing roughly every 10 to 15 years, were brief notations that made Elliot's stomach tighten. August of 2008. Background synchronization event. Duration 4 seconds. No source identified. November of 1993. Unexplained signal uniformity. Investigated. Equipment normal. Event ceased. June of 1978. Cosmic noise collapse. Brief. Resolved without intervention. Each time the same pattern. A short period of impossible uniformity. No explanation, no follow-up. Just a note in the logs, and then nothing. The events had been dismissed because they were brief, because they resolved themselves, and because nothing else happened. Until now. Elliot printed the relevant log entries and spread them across the breakroom table. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Every decade or so, something caused the cosmic background to synchronize briefly. And every time, the event was ignored, filed away, forgotten. Why? Because following up would mean acknowledging something impossible. And acknowledging something impossible would mean consequences, questions, attention. Much easier to log it and move on. Elliot returned to the monitoring room and pulled up the most recent data from Unit 7. The cosmic background noise was behaving normally, random fluctuations across all frequency bands. He initiated another calibration pulse. He did not ask permission. The pulse transmitted at 22 minutes past midnight. 8 seconds later, the response came. But this time, it was different. The signal did not simply mirror the calibration pulse. It evolved. The harmonic structure was more complex, the timing more precise. It was as if whatever was responding had learned from the first exchange, as if it understood better now. Elliot recorded everything. He sent the data to Marcus. He saved multiple backups, and then he waited. The response came again the next night, without any calibration pulse from his end. At exactly 8 seconds past midnight, Unit 7 registered a signal, identical in structure to the responses he had recorded, but unprompted, as if whatever was out there had decided to initiate contact on its own terms. Elliot documented it all. The signals were evolving, not words, not symbols, nothing that resembled human communication. Instead, they showed timing shifts, harmonic layering, patterns that breathed, expanding and contracting like something alive. It was communication without language, structure without syntax, as if the intelligence behind the signals did not understand sound the way humans did. It only understood structure, pattern, relationship. Marcus called him at 2 a.m. "I have been analysing the data you sent. Elliot, this signal is not coming from space." "What do you mean?" "The propagation characteristics are wrong. If this were a distant source, we would see dispersion, delay, degradation. This signal has none of that. It is appearing simultaneously across multiple frequency bands with no time lag." "That is impossible." "Yes, which means our assumptions are wrong. This is not a transmission from a point source. It is something else." "Like what?" "I do not know, but I checked something. I accessed archived data from other monitoring stations, deep-sea cable noise logs, old radio astronomy recordings. Elliot, the pattern appears everywhere. Brief moments of signal synchronization going back decades, always dismissed as interference, always ignored." Elliot felt something cold settle in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this encounter is not local. It is global. Whatever is responding has been present for a very long time. We just never noticed." That night, Elliot barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of vast patterns moving through empty space, invisible and patient, waiting for the right signal to finally respond. The next morning, he arrived at the station to find his access credentials had been revoked. The door lock blinked red when he tried his keycard. He called Patricia. She answered immediately. "Elliot, you have been removed from this assignment effective immediately." "Why?" "Equipment irregularities. Your access is a liability." "What irregularities?" "That is not your concern anymore. Report to Ottawa for reassignment." "Patricia, something is responding to our signals. You know that. The logs prove it has happened before." Silence. Then Patricia spoke, her voice very quiet. "Elliot, this station is closing. The data will be archived. The equipment will be decommissioned. Whatever you think you observed will be noted in the final report as a calibration anomaly. You need to let this go." "Why?" "Because some questions do not have good answers, and some answers do not lead anywhere useful." The call ended. Elliot sat in his truck, engine running for warmth, staring at the station he could no longer enter. 48 hours after he first noticed the signal, his entire investigation had been shut down. His access revoked, his findings dismissed, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. That evening, Marcus called with more information. "I contacted colleagues at other institutions. Everyone has similar data. Brief periods of signal uniformity. Always dismissed. Always filed away. But Elliot, there is a pattern to when it happens." "What pattern?" "It correlates with advances in global timing technology. GPS satellites, international atomic clock synchronization, fiber optic networks with microsecond timing precision. Every time humanity's technology becomes more temporally synchronized, these events increase in frequency." "Why would that matter?" "Because maybe timing is the language. Maybe this intelligence does not communicate through meaning or symbols. It communicates through structure. And for decades, our signals were too chaotic, too random, but modern technology changed that. We created global timing standards, synchronized clocks, uniform protocols. We finally spoke in a way this presence could recognize. Not intentionally. No, but inevitably." Elliot understood then what had happened. Humanity had not made first contact through deliberate effort, not through SETI, not through carefully composed messages beamed toward distant stars. Instead, contact had occurred as an accident of infrastructure. We built systems that required precise timing, and something noticed, something that existed not as a craft or a being, but as a distributed presence, something that lived in fields, not bodies, something that did not travel, because it was already everywhere, woven into the fabric of electromagnetic reality itself, waiting, listening, until humanity finally spoke clearly enough to be understood. Elliot never returned to the White Horse Station. It was shut down 2 weeks later. The equipment was decommissioned. The data was archived in locations he did not have clearance to access. Officially, the anomalous signals were classified as equipment malfunction, interference, calibration errors. Unofficially, nothing was said at all. But Elliot kept monitoring. Not through official channels, not through government equipment, through publicly available data, radio astronomy archives, deep space monitoring reports, amateur satellite tracking forums. And over the following months, he noticed something. The cosmic background noise was changing, subtly, so subtly that most monitoring systems filtered it out as irrelevant. But it was there, faint patterns, recurring structures, harmonic relationships that should not exist in random noise. The universe sounded organized. Elliot shared his findings with Marcus, who confirmed it independently. "It is everywhere," Marcus said. "Not loud, not obvious, but consistent, as if something is actively maintaining structure in what should be chaos." What does that mean? It means we were noticed, and whatever noticed us is still paying attention. There were no sightings, no lights in the sky, no silver discs hovering over cities. Contact did not arrive in any form humanity had imagined. Instead, it manifested as awareness. Something vast and patient had heard humanity's accidental signal, and instead of visiting, instead of revealing itself, it had simply acknowledged our existence, and now it was listening. Elliot thought about this often, late at night, when the world was quiet and he could almost hear the hum of electromagnetic fields carrying signals across the globe. Humanity had spent decades broadcasting into space, hoping for a response. We sent mathematical formulas, cultural information, maps showing our location, all of it deliberate, all of it intentional, and all of it ignored. Because we were shouting in a language no one spoke. But when we built GPS satellites, when we synchronized atomic clocks across continents, when we created technology that required microsecond precision across global networks, we finally said something comprehensible. Not a greeting, not a message, just structure. And something answered, not with words, not with ships, but with attention. 6 months after the White Horse Station closed, Elliot received an unmarked envelope at his new assignment. Inside was a single piece of paper, a graph showing cosmic background measurements from multiple monitoring stations across the globe. The patterns were unmistakable now, synchronized, structured, intentional. At the bottom of the page, someone had written a single sentence in pen. "This should not continue." Elliot kept the paper. He also kept monitoring, because the truth was already loose, not in dramatic revelations or government press conferences, but in the quiet accumulation of data, in the subtle changes to background noise that careful observers were beginning to notice. Humanity had made contact, not through intention, but through infrastructure. And whatever had made contact in return was not going away. It was embedding itself deeper into the electromagnetic spectrum, learning, adapting, waiting to see what humanity would do next. Elliot sometimes wondered what would happen when the presence decided to move beyond listening, when acknowledgement became interaction, when the patterns in the noise resolved into something unmistakable. But for now, the contact remained quiet. A presence in the static, a structure in the chaos, proof that we were no longer alone, and proof that we had been noticed by something that did not think the way we did not exist the way we did, and did not want the same things we wanted. As something that had been waiting a very long time, and was now fully aware of our existence. On a cold night in late March, Elliot initiated one final calibration pulse from a university radio telescope where Marcus worked. They waited. 8 seconds later, the response came. But this time, it did not mirror their signal. It anticipated it. The response arrived 7 seconds after transmission, then 6 seconds, then 5. The presence was learning, understanding, adapting to human timing, human patterns, human structure. It was closing the gap between signal and response, moving from acknowledgement towards something that looked disturbingly like conversation. Marcus and Elliot stared at the data in silence. Finally, Marcus spoke. "What do we do?" Elliot did not have an answer. Humanity had asked if anyone was out there. The universe had answered, not with a visit, but with attention. And now something vast and patient and utterly alien was learning to speak our language. Not because it wanted to communicate meaning, but because it wanted to understand structure. And once it understood structure, what would it do? Elliot shut down the equipment and walked outside. The sky was clear. Stars scattered across the darkness in familiar patterns. Somewhere among those stars, conventional wisdom said intelligent life might exist. But the truth was closer and stranger, and it had been listening all along. We never asked if anyone was out there. We just built systems loud enough to be noticed, and the universe finally answered, not with a visit, but with attention. The question now was what came next. What happened when attention became intention? When listening became action? When the quiet contact stopped being quiet? Elliot looked up at the stars and felt the weight of all the electromagnetic signals humanity had ever transmitted, spreading outward at the speed of light, announcing our presence to a universe we barely understood. And somewhere in the fabric of that universe, something was listening, learning, waiting. The age of accidental contact had begun, and there was no going back.